Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. The world watched Sunday as 3 women held hostage in Gaza for 468 days, reunited with their families. The moving footage was juxtaposed against the frightening prospect of more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, many of them convicted murderers and terrorists, would eventually return to freedom as well in exchange for the hostages. There was also the strange irony of a hostage crisis nearing an end, amid a transition in the White House, just a week after President Carter, who departed the White House as the Iran hostage crisis neared an end, was laid to rest. Here to discuss the painful and painstaking process of bringing the hostages home is Julie Fishman Rayman, AJC's Managing Director of Policy and Political Affairs. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Manya, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to tell this amazing story.
It has been a long 470 days now for you and your team, as you have worked so closely with hostages' families. What was it like for you to watch those reunion videos?
Pure joy. One of the things that I talk about with my team a lot is that we missed an opportunity during the last agreement, during the last releases, to really celebrate. We sort of thought, oh, okay, this is it. Now we're going to soon be able to celebrate everyone coming home. But what we missed in that moment was that was just the end of the sprint and the start of the marathon that we've been in now for so long. So being able to see these 3 released, all I could think was, Dayenu, this would be enough. After all of this, after all the work, after all the agony, and certainly the families don't feel that way. And our work must continue. There's no question. We have to keep going until they're all home. But even if it were just Emily, just Romi, just Doron, this, to me, personally, feels enough.
There was also talk of the very high price that was paid for these hostages to return. It was so wonderful to see Gilad Shalit return home, but at the cost of more than 1,000 prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar, who was the architect of the October 7th attack. And so I know there is this huge fear among Israelis now, and that there are efforts underway to prevent this kind of deal, specifically this kind of deal, from happening again. But where do you stand on this? Where does AJC stand on this? And where do the families stand on this?
Well, I'll start by answering your question with regards to the families, because they are not a monolith. They're not unanimous in their opinions on this. And a lot of them, even within families, feel very ambivalent and don't even necessarily feel the same way in the morning that they do in the evening, because there's just so much emotion around this. Any deal to get hostages, to get political prisoners, to get anyone unjustly held released is ugly. If you peel back the onion layers or look behind the curtain, you see all of the really yucky things that we don't want to acknowledge about, negotiating with terrorists, about allowing people who have committed the most heinous crimes to be free. But that's the only way it works. Right? That's the only way you get to an agreement. So unless you are fully confident as, a government or a power that has citizens held unjustly, that you are going to be able to complete many heroic rescues, as the Israeli Defense Forces has done, the only viable solution is to get to a deal. And I think that there's a recognition in the United States, in Israel, that a deal was the only way to get these folks released, finally. But there are really heavy costs to be paid. And I do feel as though there's a nervousness. What comes? What happens next?
And then, of course, there's also the trauma that a number of survivors are feeling out there whose family members were murdered by these prisoners who are going free. Has AJC worked with them in any way and connected with them in any way?
I believe our Jerusalem office knows a number of those families. and has some of those connections on the ground. We have not engaged with them in Washington or in our work sort of throughout the United States in the same way that we have with hostage families. But one of the things that I think is incumbent, not just on AJC, but really on the Jewish community and all who care about Israel, is to lift up those stories and to sort of collectively hold the pain of those families who felt when the murderers of their family members, when they were imprisoned, they felt, okay, we have justice. Like we have a sense of closure, and that this pain that we've endured has not been for no reason. And now they have to go back into that trauma and go back into that pain, and without that sort of sense of closure. So there's a lot of trauma that those families are going to be going through. And if we've learned one major lesson from this big hostage ordeal that we're going through now, is that the pain of one family in Israel is not exclusive to that family, that it reverberates throughout society, that it ripples throughout the entire population. And so as one family is grieving or suffering, all of the families are. That's one thing that we've seen throughout the course of the last, 478 days in Israel, that the families are not alone, that the tragedy and the horror that they have experienced has created this terrific rift in a lot of ways in Israeli society, this feeling of a lack of trust that the government, that the Israeli Defense Forces, that the population as a whole could protect them to this point. And we can only hope that this deal will be concluded, that as we're in phase one, that phase two will continue to be negotiated, that we'll get to the end so that the families can all be reunited. And this feeling of cohesion in Israeli society and throughout the diaspora can continue.
Julie, can you share with our audience, I said you and your team worked closely with the hostages' families and have been ever since this ordeal on October 7th. Can you explain to our audience what that means? What have you been doing? What have you been working toward? And how have you been working toward it?
Absolutely. So since the very early days after October 7th, we've been deeply engaged with families. And it started just, I think, 5 or 6 days after the 7th. My phone rang, and it was a number from Israel. I didn't know the number, but of course, it's a number from Israel. I'm going to answer. So I answer, and the caller explained that he was John Poland, the father of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, that his son had part of his arm blown off by a grenade. They knew that. And that he was being held hostage, and that he was one of many, many parents who are going through this experience. And he didn't really know what to do. And could we help? And choking back tears, right? Choking them back. I said, yes, of course we can help. Let's talk this out. Let's make a plan. But AJC is here. We're here for your family. We can be here for the families. And it started what I think none of us could have imagined in terms of this ongoing, continuous support, not just for John and Rachel, although we continue to stay very closely engaged with them, but for more than 50 families who started seeing elected officials when they traveled to Israel, who started to come to Washington, D.C., because they felt like in Washington, the elected officials that they could meet with had power, had influence, would hear their stories and try to, move heaven and earth for their children. So virtually, every month at least, sometimes every week, every other week, we opened our doors in Washington, D.C. We opened our Rolodexes and said, we'll help you with meetings, whether that was with members of Congress, with the administration, with members of the media, with the diplomatic corps, with other partners. Sometimes the delegations were random. It was whichever family members wanted to come. Sometimes they were specific, right? Sometimes we would bring family members of female hostages to talk specifically about their concerns related to gender-based violence, and just simply try to give them the biggest and broadest platform that we could to tell their stories. And that's what they've been doing for 470 days. And that's what needs to continue, really and truly, until every single hostage comes home.
Clearly, Monday was also a big day here in the United States. President Joe Biden left the White House handed the keys back to Donald Trump, who was inaugurated as the 47th president. And really, I could not help but think about the Carter-Reagan transition and the Iran hostage crisis that came to an end soon after. Clearly, Trump has made the issue of releasing the hostages a core foreign policy priority for his administration. What is the reaction you're hearing from the families about the Trump administration's efforts, as well as the efforts by the former Biden administration?
The families had really great access within the Biden administration, really at the very top. A lot of the families, especially the families of the American hostages, met with some frequency with the president himself, with Jake Sullivan, with Roger Carstens, the special envoy for hostages, and really felt as though this administration was with them on this horrific journey. And they always spoke with and continue to speak with a lot of gratitude towards the Biden administration. But it also became very clear that when Trump was elected, that they were eager to seize on any opportunity. And so you talk about this Carter-Reagan sort of moment. The families for some time had been talking to the president-elect, now president, and his team and saying, we need a Reagan moment. This can be President Trump's Reagan moment. They've been planting that seed and really playing to the hope that this would be something that would be meaningful as well for him. And I think we're deeply successful in doing this. We would not be where we are today without this amazing display of collaboration between the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration. The ability for the two of them to work together, build on what the Biden administration had been doing for so long, and then also come in with this sort of bravado of President Trump and a commitment. Really, he said, going to rain hell down if the hostages aren't released. So sort of the combination of these efforts, I think, was so remarkable and really got us to where we are today. But we're not there yet. And so, as we celebrate Emily and Doron and Romi's return, their triumphant return, we also know that there's a lot that could continue to go wrong at any stage of this agreement. And even President Trump himself said, I'm not confident. And this is from a man who is sort of eternally confident. So the fact that he's expressing that caution, that nervousness about the ability to get to the finish line means that we still, and the family still, have a lot of work to do.
I find it interesting that you are referring to it as a collaboration, because my next question was going to be, how much credit does the incoming administration deserve for the hostage deal versus the outgoing administration? Would you say it really was a genuine collaboration?
All signs point to a genuine collaboration. I think there's a lot that we don't know and we won't know for some time. Just as when we look at, the last 470 days, there's so much of this amazing story that needs to be told. I feel very proud about the role that AJC played, but success has many people to credit, always. And there were tons of players, not just in Washington, D.C., across the country, across the globe, who made it possible to get to where we are today. So it will be very interesting. At this point, we sort of see a jockeying for credit amongst the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration. I am willing to give that credit out like candy on Halloween. Everyone who had the smallest part should be taking that victory lap, patting themselves on the back, and then preparing themselves for the next round of advocacy and pressure.
President Trump did have former hostages at his rally at the arena on Monday night. What message do you think he was trying to send? And I'll follow that with, what message do you think they are taking back home to Israel?
I am ecstatic that he brought the families up on stage with him. I think that was such a meaningful moment and certainly deeply meaningful to them, because amidst all of this, there must be some fear that, okay, we've started to bring people home. what if we don't get across the finish line, right? So the commitment, even after Emily, Doron, and Romi were returned, to bring them up and to show the importance of their families and their cause, I think was deeply, deeply important. Cynically, I think part of that was to show, look, I've just come into office and look at the win that I've already had. But if it takes that sort of seizing of credit to keep the push going, I welcome that 100% without question. The families will no doubt take tremendous comfort in the fact that they were called up to stage, that representatives of this really large and robust community, sad community of the hostage families, that they had representatives called up on that stage. I think they'll see that as a really important signal that their cause is not forgotten, that even as there are celebrations welcoming Romi and Emily and Doron back, that this is not a box that has been checked, but rather a recognition that this is a job not yet finished.
So with that in mind, Julie, what are your priorities? What are AJC's priorities with this new administration?
We are looking for every opportunity to engage with this administration as closely as we did with the last around the issues that are really important to AJC. And first and foremost, of course, that is support for Israel. That is making sure that the U.S. Israel relationship remains strong, that the United States is continuing to play a vital role in supporting Israel on the world stage, whether that's at the UN, with European partners and so on, and lifting up our vital ally in this moment. And not secondarily, just secondarily in terms of how I'm talking about it, but of equal importance is working with this administration to counter anti-Semitism in all its forms, from all its sources. We worked really hand in glove with the Biden administration on not just creating, but implementing the first ever U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. And I think it's fair to say that there were a lot of phenomenal successes that came out of that strategy. And now it's a matter of working with the incoming administration officials and the president himself to make sure that we are moving forward, that this idea that it requires the whole of government and all of society to be working together, to be working in tandem and coordination in lockstep to counter anti-Semitism, that strategy in and of itself is critical. So whether it's something written on paper or implemented in that way, or whether it's, appointing a coordinator or what have you, we are here and we're ready to be a part of that process.
Julie, thank you so much for joining us the day after the inauguration and all of the many changes that began to unfold. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Manya.
Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.